Hi, everyone. I hope everyone had a good lunch. So when Shuwei and I started talking about this panel, and we saw that originally the memo that we received was, it's a conversation between two Durians, Shuwei was like, are we the Durians? And you know what? We've decided to embrace that, and we are going to embody the spirit of the Durian and be a little bit spiky today and raise a stink.
And so we're actually not going to talk about what is advertised on the program and go a little bit off topic and essentially summarize the sort of conversation we had over dinner last night, which went in very different directions and mirrored some of the content that sort of we went over today.
Yes. And before we start that, do we want to introduce ourselves? Shuwei, do you want to start?
I'm Shuwei Fang. I am a Shorenstein Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. I spent 10 years at Open Society Foundations, funding and investing in media in the public interest. Prior to that, I had a background in investing and gaming startups.
And I'm Karen Howe. I am a journalist that's been covering AI since 2018 for publications like MIT Tech Review, Wall Street Journal, and I now freelance for various outlets like More Perfect Union and The Atlantic. And I just came out with a book earlier this year called Empire of AI that tells the inside story. Thank you. Tells the inside story of OpenAI, but uses that as a way to explore much bigger questions about what future are we actually headed toward and how do we actually change the future that these Silicon Valley giants are building to one that actually benefits people and the planet. So with that, Shuwei, do you want to kick us off with, we've heard a lot in the morning about all of the different threats, essentially, to media, to the information ecosystem, and I feel like there have been many threats articulated, but you have a particularly great framework for thinking about kind of the state of play right now and how media and information is being squeezed from multiple sides. And so could you lay that out for us?
Yes, and to be clear that when Karen said that we were going to be Durian-like in her intro, we are going to deliberately provoke this room a little bit. I think the stuff that was covered was very interesting this morning, but I think our goal for this session is to push a little bit further. So I want to just summarize what's been said in this room, and as well sort of put a bit more of a framework around it. So I think we're essentially moving towards an AI-mediated information ecosystem, wherein I think the key characteristic is that we're shifting from fixed information artifacts to liquid information flows. And by liquid, I mean information that can be reshaped infinitely. The same core information can become an article, a summary, a podcast, with little friction or human intervention. So leaving aside the debates about information integrity, I think this has essentially profound impacts on society as a whole. But one of the clearest structural changes I see coming for the media is the commodification of content. And content is something that we've been talking about a lot this morning. And that is, I think, that content increasingly holds little economic value. And to be clear, I think it's still important. But when AI can infinitely shape and reshape and reinterpret with functional agency at diminishing marginal cost, the article or the artifact itself is no longer the store of value, and that value migrates elsewhere. So I think essentially it's this economic driving force that means the information market, and I don't mean just media and journalism, I think sort of the entire knowledge production as a sector as a whole, not just our vertical, essentially bifurcates into a spectrum with extreme ends. On one extreme, you have very high-end premium content offerings offerings which are based on brand. So the New York Times, successful Substackers are examples. They have high margins, relatively small audiences compared to the other extreme, and they compete on uniqueness. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have this commodity information flow, which essentially entities and producers produce driven by unit economics, to be consumed by machines, which then reinterpret at the narrative level. So this is kind of products competing at scale with near zero marginal cost, but also razor-thin margins. So the Bloombergs, the Reuters are kind of already there, but they'll face competition from AI platforms. What I think will happen in the sort of coming years, in the near future, is that existing in a legacy, what we know as traditional media, essentially moves up towards the premium end because they cannot compete at the scale end. So they move up the value chain. And they retreat and double down on direct audience relationships. And because of this bifurcation, which is really essentially around production costs and that principle of organizing, media organizations as we know them cannot compete at more than one end of the spectrum. They have to sort of go in divergent directions. Along the spectrum, I think that media will face competition all the way across from AI native organizations, whether it's AI platforms at the sort of commodity end, and then hybrids and new entrants along the other end. Ultimately, I think this moment, and this is the part where I'm going to be deliberately a little bit more provocative, it's a pivotal moment for journalism because it's a forcing function, this paradigm shift, that makes us essentially re-examine where value lies, and more importantly, where social and economic value could align. And this essentially is a paradox wherein the news product, the piece of content, the artifact, becomes increasingly commoditized and has little value. But by contrast, the journalistic process, so verification, accountability, sense-making, potentially has even more value than ever. So I think we're at the point where the question is whether or not new models can be identified and built around those intangible parts of the process that leverages that value. So my provocation or Durian moment is, what if we let go of the artifact and stopped equating value with that and focused on the process instead? So I think that's, I guess, my summary plus a little bit extra. All of this is happening, this transformation is happening under the sort of greater umbrella of the political economy of AI development and power concentration. And so, Karen, your book essentially frames this as an empire. Can you help us understand how consequential this is for journalism and what our role is in this new paradigm?
Yeah, so if I could bring up my slides, I just have 3 quick slides that present my framework for how I'm thinking about these things. So I call companies, these AI companies, empires of AI, because I think it is the only way to truly articulate the degree of power that they have and also the tactics that they use to consolidate that power. So there are 4 parallels that I draw upon in my book. One is that they lay claim to resources that are not their own. They're hoovering up all of this data and using that to train their models without actually giving credit or compensation to different people. They're exploiting an extraordinary amount of labor. That includes the thousands, tens of thousands of workers that they contract around the world, often from the global south, that are producing extraordinary economic value for the organizations, but rarely seeing a justifiable proportion of that value in return, as well as the fact that these organizations are ultimately designing their AI systems to be labor automating machines, and this is an explicit political and design choice. They do not have to design AI in that way, and so when they deploy these technologies into the world, it also erodes away labor rights for many people. They monopolize knowledge production. That refers to the way that I list here like their dominance in AI research, but we've also talked about another way that they monopolize knowledge production, which is that they control various different forms of narrative by co-opting the media, by also just playing these games where ultimately the narratives that exist in the public domain end up supporting and continuing the imperial expansion rather than keeping them in check. And then the last thing is that they justify their actions with this moral or existential imperative where they frame everything that they do, all of the gutting out of public resources, the exploitation of labor, and so on, as an actual civilizing mission to usher progress and modernity to the rest of the world. And they're always competing against some kind of evil empire. And in my book, I talk about how OpenAI originally frames Google as the evil empire, and now China's the evil empire. But the evil empire, if they get their first will lead to the demise of humanity. And that's why we cannot regulate these companies. We cannot hold them back because they are the, fortifying liberalism around the world and bringing us to a new utopia. And the main thing the reason why these companies have been able to effectively consume all these resources and engage in this narrative is in part because of a particular path of AI development that they are on, which is purely indexed on scale. This idea that scaling the amount of data that they use to train models and the size of the supercomputers that they use to train models is somehow going to lead us closer and closer to an artificial general intelligence that's going to lead us to nirvana. And this is, I wanted to show this visually because these two charts show the degree of scale that has happened from the 1950s when AI was first coined as a term all the way to present day. And these two charts are in logarithmic scale themselves. So you have to imagine what this would look like in linear scale. It's an exponential swoop that is getting faster and faster and faster to the point where now these companies are talking about, consuming all of the energy on the planet and all of the capital on the planet to produce their technologies. And this is just another way of visualizing the same thing, just from OpenAI's technologies. At the time in 2019, GPT-2 was considered the largest model that had ever been trained. And now it's like hilariously tiny compared to GPT-4 and everything that's coming after it. And just to give you more sense of scale, like Altman is talking about wanting to build 250 gigawatts of data centers by 2033 to the tune of $10 trillion in order to continue building the next generation of OpenAI's models. 250 gigawatts, like New York City is 5.5 gigawatts. So this is 4 dozen New York Cities worth of what someone once called to me like sweaty iPhones. Like New York Cities of sweaty iPhones that are just like computing and training some kind of generation, some kind of GPT. And so my provocation, I guess for the audience, this is my Durian moment, is that I was honestly pretty disappointed with the sessions this morning because while I enjoyed every single person's point and what they were making, by and large, the vibe that I got was that we are trying to orient ourselves to fit a game that these empires have laid out rather than just fundamentally bucking what they want the future to be and building on our own. Like the fact that we're having conversations about how do we now atomize the information that we gather to make it more machine readable so that it has economic value, to me is a fundamental capitulation of what journalism and the media is ultimately about. Like, and like they have set up the game such that it's a game of capital, and we are ultimately trying to conform journalism into this capitalist paradigm. And anytime you shift to a game of capital, the people who have the most cash are the ones who win. Who's gonna buy that machine-readable data that we are now generating? Who has the cash to actually purchase it? Who's gonna be the highest bidder on the market? It's going to be the empires. And when we say, let's create our own large language models, like why are we creating large language models? Like the companies, they defined large language models as like the rules of the road for the next era, and now we're just trying to contort ourselves into, okay, we're gonna accept the rules and just figure out how to build our own thing that's exactly the same as your thing, but instead like we own it. Like why are we not just fundamentally rethinking what are the new types of AI technologies, the new types of paradigms, the new value generation frameworks that we should be using rather than inheriting one that was explicitly designed to undermine us. So with with our two frameworks laid out, what, Shuwei, do you think we should actually be doing as the media to prepare, or people that are defenders of the information ecosystem? Like how do we, in fact, evolve ourselves and build new models of innovation that are not just accepting what the tech companies want us to believe is innovation?
So I think there is the acceptance of what the tech companies want us to believe is innovation, but there's also a sort of continuation of an existing legacy journalistic workflow that is declining long-term in value and being eaten by these systems. So I think while it is important to essentially pursue the strategies that was discussed in the morning around compensation and protecting content and sort of getting the right thing, I think we need to start planning for the longer term and essentially to see the other side of this paradigm shift. So structurally, AI changes the entire competitive environment, and externally, the existing sort of professional class of journalism faces external competition on two fronts that I think, two major fronts. One is the really familiar sort of AI models, essentially extracting value from content. So essentially producing, so extracting value from content without producing any original reporting. It's something we've talked about extensively. But I think there's another part, there's another interesting external competitive shift that this traditional class of information producers is seeing. And I think I see this as a sort of interesting opportunity rather than a threat, which are entirely new types of startups fit for this paradigm. And two are like entirely different. So there's 404 Media on the one end, which is this very high-end, high-touch human product, which is essentially a different organizing principle of journalism. And the product, the news product, is pretty familiar. But then there are sort of more on the technical side of things, the infrastructure side of things, products like experimental startups like Applied XL, whose founder is a former journalist. So it's essentially a tech company with journalistic DNA. It's an editorial algorithm that doesn't produce any content, but is productizing the process. So I think these are entirely new ways of doing the craft without playing the game, which I think eventually becomes zero-sum. At the moment, I think the biggest threat is really like kind of internal to news organizations. And you know, they face a bind. It's really understandable to face this problem. Many newsrooms are essentially still optimized, and you know, they face little choice in this matter. Many newsrooms are still optimizing for existing content production and workflows in a world where content is becoming more commoditized. So they're essentially using AI to produce more artifacts while at the same time optimizing for AI discoverability in a sort of vicious circle. Long term, I don't think this is sustainable. So what do I think they should pursue? I think it's important to do some of the strategies, the mitigation strategies, the transitional strategies that we talked about this morning. But I also think that this is a time to radically rethink the core values of journalism. What it, you know, from a first principles approach, what is it? What is it for? How does it provide utilities to the end user? And really rethink what remains scarce and valuable. And at the moment, I think it's certain intangible things, which is the ability to maintain trust networks, provide accountability, which LLMs are pretty bad at. And ultimately, I think, you know, one of the final scarcities, I'm not a journalist, but this is something I highly admire, is the courage and the clarity to ask the right questions. And these are all capabilities, not content. So I think some of these can be expressed in technological builds. Some of these can be expressed in new business models. And now's the time to start radically experimenting with these. And really, you know, what the sector needs is capital and creativity to be able to do this. A really visceral example of what I just talked about in action was something that I experienced a couple months ago. I was in San Francisco for Tech Week, and I was at a founder breakfast. And all of these founders were really talking about their go-to-market strategies. And in terms of PR, you know, the gold standard for what they wanted to get was essentially, you know, a write-up in TechCrunch or a founder profile in the Wall Street Journal. So essentially, these tech companies, which are seeking to disrupt traditional knowledge production industries, are still desperately need legacy media's legitimacy to confer like the power for them to succeed. And so that intangible, the ability to validate, to confer legitimacy, to independently determine what matters, I think that's something that this sector sort of should be figuring out how to essentially like build around in this new ecosystem. I think there's also like a fundamentally a bigger shift that we're moving towards, but I think we probably should double down on, and that's towards the sort of broader definition of journalism. I think this paradigm shift essentially means that there's going to be a less defined professional class of journalists, and increasingly, whether that's like through tech companies with journalistic DNA, community companies with journalistic DNA, or anything else, there are different entities producing functionally what journalism is, and so if we define it by the process and not the artifact, it essentially means a larger community of practice to learn from and a broader set of allies. So, given this, and what we've discussed so far, I'm so curious to sort of understand, if you're a technologist and a journalist, so if you were starting from scratch, from first principles, what would your vision of journalism be?
Small questions. I wanted to first pick up on what you were saying about the SF Tech Week experience, because this is something that I find super funny, is like, so many media companies are now talking about how they should become tech companies, which I think is actually, it is a very valuable conversation, and I think that we absolutely should be doing that. Like, we should be figuring out how do we build our own internal tech capabilities so that we're not actually becoming dependent on the very entities that are trying to undermine us. But the funny thing is, tech companies are also trying to become media companies. And, Gina knows I love and respect her work, and she said earlier today that people don't want long-form content anymore, and I completely disagree, because every single media brand that is coming out of Silicon Valley is only doing long-form. Lex Fridman, most popular podcast, among the most popular podcasts on Apple Podcasts, like in general, some of his episodes are 5 or 6 hours long, like 5 or 6 hour interviews, and they're garnering millions of views. All In podcast, same thing, 1 to 2 hours long. Dwarkesh Patel, this AI researcher, like sometimes 2 to 3 hours long. And these are like the most popular media brands that are out there now. And like in my own work, the things that I've produced that have gotten the most attention and the most engagement have been my longest things ever. Like, the most popular piece that I ever wrote was a 7,000 word piece about Facebook, and it was read more than 500,000 times. And my book is really freaking long for anyone that's read it. Like, the audiobook itself is like 19 hours long, and that is one of the most popular things that I've ever produced. So I do think that, like, I guess to go back to your question of like this vision of journalism, I think we need to first articulate actually what do people genuinely want. Like, we need to spend more time figuring out what the first principles are that we're going to be building from, because I think we've gotten it wrong. And we need to spend more time not just innovating on how to distribute content through platforms, but innovating on how to rebuild up relationships with our audiences and with communities outside of using tech mediation. Like having more like community-oriented events, having more people-to-people interactions, so that we have a better understanding of like where people are actually at and what information they actually need, and then we can figure out from there how do we design different systems, formats, artifacts, processes to serve that. But I do think that a lot of the conversations around where media is headed, the general trends like shrinking attention spans, where we have been trying to pressure ourselves to become smaller and smaller and smaller, is in fact the opposite of what we should be trying to do, and what the marketplace has actually shown is not the right direction. So yeah, I don't know if I fully answered your question, but like, yay journalism! We should continue doing the things that have served the public for a long time. We just need to, like, we've become a little bit too detached from understanding what the public service actually is.
No, I think that's totally coherent, just to understand the first principles, the role for society, and build up from there natively, like kind of forgetting all the legacy baggage that we've become accustomed to and all the dependencies that we've become reliant on.
Yeah. So that leads us to how do you imagine, like, I had asked you yesterday during dinner when we were talking about, like, the future journalism.
And you were horrified.
Yeah, I was initially like, I gave a really terrible look to Shuwei, where I was like, what do you mean we're gonna have machine readable editorial algorithms? Like, this is not okay. But I was asking you, like, what would you imagine this newsroom of the future would look like? Like, what kind of roles would journalists play? What would be a day in the life of a journalist in this future where we are trying to move away from commoditized content creation to like more valuable original reporting and information and generation in the public interest?
Yeah, so I guess when I talk about this a lot, I get the same sort of very visceral reaction of, you know, we've gone from chefs to sort of feeding nutritional paste into tubes for machines. And I really don't accept that the future of the role of journalism will be reduced to essentially news gathering for machine intermediation. I think we should probably look back at the last 10 years and sort of realize that there are entirely new formats and roles and different, essentially new jobs for journalists that never existed before. So data journalism 10 years ago didn't really exist until Gina and Irene and Fang invented it. And OSI, open source investigation techniques weren't around. So I think in the same vein, this sort of technology, the paradigm shift, consumer behavior, entirely enables new forms and new functions which we lack the imagination to describe yet. They are emerging and they are experimental at the moment. And I always look to the gaming sector, which is a relatively young tech-enabled sort of medium that's constantly coming up with new categories, kind of enabled by tech, sometimes not. So walking sims are an entirely new method of storytelling. Cozy games, who knew that was going to be a thing? But essentially, that's a new way of conveying emotion. I think these are sort of, there are new products, there are new mediums, there are new processes, new jobs. So I think far from being reduced to this like feeding paste job, if we think of journalism as an expression, the role of journalism and journalists as an expression of the values and the process, then it could actually be a far more distributed and expanded version of the profession. So I think that's my optimistic view. I think in the next few years it's going to get really, really rough. So, Karen, I think we're almost at 5 minutes left.
Why don't we just move to questions?
Should we move to questions?
Yeah, why don't we just move to audience questions?
Do we want questions?
We've been very Durian-like, and we should probably allow people to ask questions and maybe provoke us back.
Hello. Hi, everyone. This is Preksha. Thank you so much for this introduction. I represent an organization called Asian Dispatch. I was curious when you said that we need to radically rethink the core values of journalism. I understand there's a lot of shift happening in the way we see the world, in general, the way we consume anything. But when you say rethink the core values of journalism, it sort of conflicts in my head because I feel that the core values or the ethics of journalism is what has helped it stand the test of time. Over the years, what you both also mentioned about public service, about how it has to essentially serve the people that it's being written for. So I was just curious that are there any particular values of journalism that you had in mind when you made this statement, or if you could elaborate on that a little?
No, I'm completely in agreement. I think that the core values are pretty much eternal. So, you know, accountability, verification, sense-making, those roles. I think everything else is up for grabs. So I think that was my miscommunication.
It's my turn. I think I might get the last question. But Karen, I wanted to ask you, you said, you know, you felt that the earlier sessions are sort of accepting the paradigm, the status quo in terms of, you know, trying to feed the empires or just accept them. What exactly is your vision, or what is the alternative?
Yeah.
Like, what would it look like?
Yeah. Well, this is, like, my vision is, it moves beyond just, like, the role of media and like, information ecosystem defenders, but there needs to be just accountability from, like, every single facet of society towards these empires. There are pillars that prop up the empire, right? We've talked about the narrative pillar that props them up. We've talked about the data that they use to train their models, the vast amounts of computational infrastructure, land, energy, and water used to train those models. The fact that they actually need broad societal acceptance in order to deploy their technologies, and Natalia talked about how like largely there's growing amounts of resistance from just like people who have kids because like there isn't actually broad acceptance for some of the ways that they deploy their technologies. And that if we, like so many of these pillars right now are being fortified by everyone just deciding that these companies are here, this technology is here, and we should just accept it. Whereas if everyone suddenly flipped to being like, wait a minute, we shouldn't accept this, and truly voice the concerns that we have about each of the things that they're doing in concert with one another, the empire would fall very quickly. Like if for the narrative pillar, if the media invested substantially more in accountability journalism, like, and actually produced the evidence to show that all of the narratives that these companies give are totally bogus, like, then that pillar is gonna fall. And we're already seeing huge amounts of protest against the data centers that is starting to chip away at that pillar. There's like dozens of communities around the world that are really, really angry about their land and their energy and their water being taken to pursue something that they ultimately don't agree with. We're seeing more and more lawsuits from those parents leveled at these companies that's also chipping away at the pillar of adoption. And we're seeing artists and writers that are like suing the companies to chip away at the data pillar. So there's like already so much that's happening. And my vision is we need to just amplify that more. And like that's the role that I think journalists ultimately play, is by teaching people that this is not inevitable and that we co-create the future that we want to see. And like these are the activities that the companies are actually engaged in. And if you do not stand for that, you have agency. Like this is like the whole purpose of journalism is to imbue people with the agency to actually create that future, to self-govern and collectively govern what we want, what worlds we want to live in, and what society we want to build eventually. And then on top of like the accountability piece of like chipping away at all of those different pillars, then we also need to find like what are the visions, the alternative visions that we can then get people to rally around instead. Because the reason why there's so little challenging of these empires right now is in part because people don't really fully understand what exists. There's like, it's the only thing that they see. And so like that's another role that journalists can play, is like we need to be surfacing different types of stories that show alternatives already being built in parts of the world that articulate a fundamentally different vision from these companies, as well as be building those alternative visions ourselves and like set an example through our own actions. Gina, remember, I love you. Before you yell at me.
I kind of feel I have to say something. But for those of you who are at JJC, Karen and I on stage together on Sunday morning, so we can continue the conversation there. I mean, so just a couple of quick points. And so I don't actually think we disagree with each other all that much. I think there's a big elephant, and we touch two sides of it. I think both things can be true. So the really quickly one, people read long stories that they're not reading stories. Trust me, I've moved into a world of being sort of a non-journalist. I mean, I'm a journalist, but not a journalist. Like I'm a consumer, and like everything's too long. Which doesn't mean I don't read long stories. I think what we have is we have selection bias. There's things we love, and for God's sake, I live with a investigative journalist who writes really long stories, and I read every word she writes. I kind of have to. But I do think we have selection bias about what we do and we don't do, and I think both things can be true. There's some things that Joe Rogan goes for 4 hours, and that's great, and most of the time I don't have time for this, and you listen to it at 2 times speed if you have to, right? I think two different questions. One, are these companies evil? And you've done the reporting, I haven't. I'll take your word for it. They're incredibly evil. And I don't think they should be continuing to build at this pace that they build, because I don't think we need AGI. But I think that's different from there is a technology that exists, and it does incredible things. It protein folds, it discovers drugs, it does a zillion things, it handles language. at a level that is better than 60 to 70% of the humans I know, and I work with some pretty good humans. So I think, so I'm trying to separate the two things. Do I want a world where none of these companies are in charge of everything? Yes. Do I want to live in a world where these technologies don't exist? Not really, because I can see the value. And the reason I can see the value, just to come back to the question, so I'm trying to get the last word in here, trying to get back to the question about like what values do we want? I want to see a world where journalism actually lives up to its promise, because it has failed for decades to live up its promise. I mean, the New York example for me is the best one, right? The New York Times, paragon of the, apologies to any New York Times people in the room, the paragon of great journalism did not cover AIDS through the early 1980s, did not cover LGBT issues because the editor at the time was incredibly homophobic. I have editorials from the New York Times from 1913 campaigning against women voting because, like, which country was ever run well by a woman, right? We have failed and failed again, and we have selective memory about the wins, about the Pentagon Papers, about the. So I want us to be able to use the technology to create a journalism that truly does serve people, and I think the technology helps us. But I agree with you. We burn it down and we start from first principles.
Yeah, I think the thing, where you started, where is like, we want the technology to exist. An important facet of this is, I often have a slide that, like AI is like the word transportation. Transportation refers to everything from bicycle to a rocket. And the examples that you brought up of like, this is an amazing technology that can protein fold and do drug discovery and work with language are 3 fundamentally different AI technologies. And some of those technologies have not come from companies, others have. And like what I ultimately am saying is not like we should just never have these companies and like ultimately the purpose is to just get rid of them and we don't have any AI at all. My 2 things are like, we should first not accept that these companies be empires, because companies can be companies without being empires, right? There was a slide that I think EM might have put up earlier, like fair exchange of value. Like the goal is not to get rid of the company or the technology. The goal is to get rid of the imperial method of developing it and the imperial way in which these companies do not give us a fair exchange of value. They just extract the value from the rest of society, and that's why they become so powerful. And so, like, ultimately, I don't want us as the media to not just be co-opted by the empires, but end up facilitating their imperial expansion by feeding them all of our high-quality data, by becoming economically dependent on them in ways where we no longer are able to provide the counter-narrative in the public interest, that continue to fuel a lot of misperceptions among the public about the inevitability of it all. And I also want us to realize that we do not have to accept these empires as the service providers for this technology. We can be building our own versions of the technology as well as going to other providers that are actually engaged in that fair exchange of value. So that, to me, I think there's a way to walk the line and negotiate between like having forms of AI that actually fortify our cause and also like holding the entities accountable that are currently the main providers of a technology that is fundamentally different from the version of AI we would actually want. Sunday morning. And with that, we are so over time, but thank you for allowing us to have a conversation between 2 Durians.
Thank you so much, Karen and Shuwei.